Welcome everyone to yet another edition of our Cemetery Saturday. As you can see from this beautiful stone, we are here in Lebanon, Connecticut, and we are here to talk about one of the most important figures in Connecticut history and also American history. He is just as important to your state as he is to the state of Connecticut. Now walk with me as we make our way through this colonial hillside graveyard to where this man is buried. You can probably tell right away which of these is his. The cemetery is, after all, named after him. We are talking today about Governor Jonathan Trumbull. Hi there, Seaside Shadows, friends, and spook hunters, and historians. It's me, Andrew. We're back again for another edition. As I said, today we are going to be talking about Governor Jonathan Trumbull. Now, you may know this name, but perhaps you don't know the entire history of Governor Jonathan Trumbull. Maybe you don't realize just how important he is to not only the history of Connecticut, but to the history of America. America, as we know it, would not exist without this man. We find ourselves here at this rather large, beautiful tomb. As you can see, despite being one of the most important historical figures in Connecticut history, this tomb is rather overgrown. It's overrun. It looks like not many people come here any longer, which is tragic because, as I have said repeatedly, and as you will come to find out, this man has an importance that cannot be understated. Buried around him are his family. To give you just a brief idea of the importance of this gentleman, let me run down the offices that he held during his life. He was a member of the Connecticut General Assembly. He was a lieutenant in the Troop of Horse. He was a lieutenant colonel in Connecticut's 12th Regiment. He was also clerk for the House of Representatives. He was the Speaker for the House of Representatives. He was a Justice of the Peace of Windham County. He was on the Council of Assistants. He was Judge of the Quorum. He was Judge of Windham County County Court, and then subsequently Judge of Windham County Superior Court. He was then Judge of Windham Probate Court. After this, he would go on to become Deputy Governor of Connecticut while it was still a colony. He would then become Chief Justice of CT's Superior Court, eventually becoming the Governor of the Connecticut colonies, until finally he was the Governor of Connecticut, the state. Governor, leader, judge, revolutionary, historical giant. These are all words that Jonathan Trumbull fits. Perhaps he is the best known governor in all of Connecticut history, but even then, how much do you really know about him if you're from Connecticut? Excuse me. He was born in Lebanon to a merchant father. He assisted in the business until he finally came of age, becoming a man at 13. It was common practice for the time that he was reaching adulthood, or what they perceived as adulthood, at 13 in colonial times. He had to decide what he wanted to do with his life, and throughout his young childhood, he had been a very religious person. He had decided that he would study divinity, and he attended Harvard University at the age of 13. Yes, he did. He would get his bachelor's from Harvard University at the age of 17. He was fiercely intelligent. At age 20, in 1730, he obtains his master's degree from Harvard after his bachelor's is converted into a master's after years of study under the Reverend Solomon Williams, and he was licensed to preach in the local area by the Wyndham Association. Though he did briefly, and I mean very briefly, preach, he was never ordained. It was never something that he invested his all into. In fact, just a few months later, he and his brother would start a merchant trading company. It was his older brother, Joseph. Tragedy, unfortunately, would strike soon after he and his brother teamed together. They had thought that they were going to be very successful businessmen, surpassing even perhaps their father. But his brother died tragically at sea. He got lost and was never found. Jonathan took the business upon his shoulders and decided to carry on. He would trade, and this was their business, goods, livestock. They would go to Boston, exchange these goods for European finer wares, and come back here to Lebanon to sell such exotic and foreign goods. It made him quite a bit of money at first. Like many historical figures in such a routine, this quickly grew tiresome to him. What life was this for someone who was so intelligent, so fiercely intelligent? The routine, the monotony, it was not for him. And so, though he continued to work as a mechanic, he began to study law in his spare time. And he decided to, in turn, after studying law, become a politician and public servant. In 1733, he would excel in this capacity, and for the next 50-some-odd years would serve as a public servant in Connecticut. On December 19th, 1735, Trumbull would marry his love, Faith Robinson, who is buried right here with him. She was the daughter of a reverend from Massachusetts. She was 17, he was 25, and their young love resulted in 6 children. Hers was a prominent family in New England and the area, and thus their coupling strengthened Jonathan's social and political standings. Combined with his public service and education, he very quickly rose to become one of Connecticut's prominent leaders. War would bring mixed things for Trumbull. The French and Indian War, to be specific. He would serve as colonel of Connecticut's 12th Regiment during the French and Indian War. He would find that war brought a boon to his business, but he himself was fighting, and it took a toll on him. And the boon that the business brought, or that the war brought to the business, would not last long. And unfortunately, Trumbull was not a great businessman. He would take on massive amounts of debt. He would give others massive loans. It seemed that despite this fierce intelligence, his business acumen was extremely lacking. He would always, for the rest of his life, find himself on the verge of bankruptcy. He was not a man of means. His power that he would get later in life did not come from wealth. His skill with oration and clever wit allowed him to outwit and outrun his debtors right up until he died. After rage of the Stamp Act in Connecticut of 1765, the people had had enough. Then Governor Thomas Fitch was ousted. In 1766, William Pitkin was elected governor, and Jonathan Trumbull was elected his deputy governor. Jonathan would then serve congruently as both deputy governor and Chief Justice of the Superior Court for Connecticut. When Pitkin died 3 years into his term, Trumbull took over and was very, very successful and popular and well-liked. Trumbull and Fitch would be fierce rivals in the re-election campaign. And though Trumbull would receive more votes than Fitch, neither man would receive the 50% of votes that was needed to be elected governor at the time. There were others running that muddied the waters and corrupted the percentages out of their favors. It left the decision in the hands of the Connecticut legislature. They went with Trumbull. He would serve as governor of Connecticut for over 14 years, through some of its most early, turbulent, and tumultuous times, the biggest being its war for independence. Jonathan Trumbull had one of the biggest opportunities to reveal his true self and his true colors when a British general by the name of Thomas Gage took control of Boston and then subsequently Massachusetts entirely. He had reached out early in his campaign to Trumbull, then governor of Connecticut, asking for promises of assistance. Trumbull was not exactly forthcoming, but he did not outright reject the British governor immediately. It was not until the battles of Lexington and Concord, after which Gage would go again to Trumbull, this time asking for aid in the form of men and provisions and munitions. Trumbull refused, and he made his choice clear: to side with the Patriots. He even told Gage that his troops and their actions would disgrace even barbarians. They would go on. 2 days before his 66th birthday, while still serving as governor of Connecticut, the General Assembly approved the Declaration of Independence. What was Trumbull going to do? You see, every single other governor had sided with the British. But Trumbull had made his voice and his choice known with his rebuttal to Gage. He would have no part in this British Empire any longer, not when this could be a free land. And so, Trumbull would remain governor of Connecticut, being the only governor to be carried over from a colony to a state. Perhaps unsurprisingly, such a patriot, such a leader, knew and was even close friends with George Washington. Washington considered Trumbull a highly respected American, even going so far as to declare him first of the patriots. To say that war, any war, would be lost without one man is an incredible stretch. However, this statement is perhaps no truer when it is used to describe Jonathan Trumbull. You see, any time during the American Revolutionary War when George Washington would come to his brother Jonathan, not brothers in blood, but brothers by bond, Jonathan would give him anything he needed. It was not without Jonathan and his pledging of the resources and men of Connecticut we would not have won the American Revolution. In fact, in the end, Trumbull and Connecticut would supply 60% of the manpower, food, clothing, shoes, and munitions of the Continental Army, not just of Connecticut, of America entirely. His merchant business became a war office, and figures such as Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, Rochambeau, Benjamin Franklin, both Samuel and John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and more were believed to have visited there and with Trumbull personally. So close were he and George that, like I said, George had given him the nickname Brother Jonathan. And a Brother Jonathan would go on to be a nickname for a steadfast and reliable American. When the war ended, Jonathan Trumbull was the only governor, as I said, to remain from before the war to after. His popularity, unfortunately, would wane, however. It was not always rosy golden sunshine for Trumbull. Despite near unanimous election in the beginning, his personal dealings and rumors of scandal, of illicit trade with British who were still occupying Long Island, would ruin his image. He remained governor until May of 1784, when he announced that he would not be seeking re-election, citing that the war and all of the tolls of being in office at the time had taken too much out of him. He would return briefly during his retirement to his study of theology. It would only last for a very brief time, as in 1785, on August 17th, at home at the age of 74, he died of a stroke, 5 years after the passing of his beloved wife. He and Faith had had 6 children, whom are buried around their grave. Only 4 of them had outlived them. The 2 who hadn't were Joseph. He lived from 1737 to 1778. He was the first commissary general to the Continental Army. He died, unfortunately, of a sudden illness. Their oldest daughter, as well, did not live past them. Faith Trumbull, named after her mother, lived from 1743 to 1775. She died of suicide by hanging. The 4 of their children that outlived them, Jonathan Jr., whose grave is here. He was an aide-de-camp to George Washington and was a governor of Connecticut as well, following in his father's footsteps. There was also Mary Trumbull. She lived from 1745 to 1831. She is buried here with her husband, William Williams, another founding father and signer of the Declaration of Independence. David Trumbull is buried here. He was Commissary General of Connecticut and was father to yet another Trumbull governor. Last was John Trumbull, the famous painter, Not to be confused with Jonathan, his father, who we've been talking about the entire time. Jonathan, the governor, was not a painter, but his last son, John Trumbull, was. He was also an aide-de-camp to George Washington for all of 19 days. And as to why it only lasted 19 days, I was unable to find. But if he was anything like his father in his youth, perhaps it was his liberal nature that riled George's feathers just a little bit. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you once again for joining us here at Seaside Shadows, and for listening to me talk about Jonathan Trumbull, a fascinating figure, one who I think his importance to Connecticut cannot be overstated. His importance to America cannot be overstated. We would not have America as it is, or as it could be, without him. Thank you once again. I'll see you tomorrow for Spooky Sunday Storytime.